You're good.
Okay.
Mhm.
What's your full name, and is there a story behind it?
So my full name now is Shoshana Rosebard. But when I was born, I was Renee Rosebard.
Is there a story behind it?
Hmm?
Is there a story behind your name?
Yes. So my parents named me after my grandmother. My father's name was Grosbars. It's my maiden name, like they say. And my first name, I was named after my mother's mother, and her name was Rosa. And her Hebrew name was Shoshana. But they never used the Hebrew name. And when I was born, they decided to call me Renee, which also starts with an R, like Rosa, because Rosa was old-fashioned, and they didn't want to name me that.
When and where were you born?
So I was born in Antwerp, Belgium, on the 23rd of October, 1948. And the Hebrew day was the 20th of Tishrei. I don't know the name. It's Tashat.
Where did you grow up, and what was it like?
So it was very nice to grow up in Antwerp, Belgium. We had a comfortable life. We lived in a beautiful apartment, especially after I was 13 years old. My parents moved. But even the apartment where I lived the first 13 years of my life was a nice apartment.
Yeah. What was it like?
The apartment?
Yeah. Like, what was Antwerp, Belgium like?
How was the setup of the apartment?
No, like, what was Antwerp, Belgium like?
Oh, Antwerp, Belgium. It's a city in Belgium that is I think it's the second largest city in Belgium. And even then, it had more than 1 million inhabitants. And it had some industry and refineries, including refineries. So the air quality wasn't so good. But it was a pleasant climate most of the year, not too hot, not too cold, but way too much rain. To my taste, I still don't like rain. There was too much rain growing up.
Yeah. Who were your closest friends, and what did you do for fun?
So when I was a kid, growing up, my closest friend was Beatrice Greenberg. And I'm still friendly with her after all these years.
Does she live in Sydney?
Now she lives in Paris. But we both grew up in Antwerp, and then when we were around 20 years old, we moved to Israel. And in Israel, I was a student. She studied more Hebrew and met her husband there. And then they got married and went to live in Paris. And she still lives in Paris, but she recently lost her husband. She might be coming to visit me, and then you will meet her. So when we were little, we lived on the same block. So to see each other, even though we were just like 5 or 6 years old, we didn't have to cross any street. We would just walk down the walkway, the sidewalk, and then ring the bell at each other's residence. And then we would play. And one of the games we played was hopscotch.
Hopscotch?
Hopscotch.
Yeah. Anything else you did for fun?
At some point, I think we rode our bikes to the nearby park.
What was your favorite subject in school? Why?
Are you talking about elementary school when I was your age or older?
Let's my age. Yeah.
Okay, let's start with your age. You are in fourth grade.
Yeah.
So when I was in fourth grade, I was in a school called SOM 3. And SOM stood for Stedelijk Onderwijs voor Meisjes. That's Dutch, because Antwerp, the main language in Antwerp is Dutch. Or you can call it Dutch or Flemish. And it's similar to German.
Yeah.
And they had public schools, and my parents sent me there because they preferred not to spend money on my education. And a Jewish school would have costed money. And for the first 6 years of elementary school, I was able to get instruction in French. They had a program called Classe de Transmutation. In English, you would say transmutation classes. And that was for a period where they used to have public schools in French, where they were teaching everything in French, but they decided not to do that anymore. But in the meanwhile, the kids whose parents spoke French were able to get instruction in French. And I was lucky to enter in one of those programs. And when I was in fourth grade, I had an excellent teacher, Madame Dufaux, I still remember her, and her husband used to work for an airline that doesn't exist anymore. But it was American. It was an American airline.
But
what?
But in Antwerp, Belgium.
So he was working for this airline in Belgium because the airline had a stop in Brussels. Brussels, the capital of Belgium, is an important city in the world, and even then it was. So this American air company had a branch in Belgium, and the husband of my teacher worked for them, and he would give her all kinds of gifts that they would give to the passengers, like maps and pencil holders, pens, that all said Pan American. And then she would give us these gifts when we did well in our classwork, and we would get prizes from Pan American. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Did you participate in any clubs or sports?
Sports. So at that age in elementary school, I wasn't too active in sports, but what I did is I tried ballet for a couple of years, maybe 2 years, but I didn't like it that much. And maybe my mother would send me here and there to some other stuff. Nothing lasted long. But I was also in a Zionist youth group, 2 different ones. I started the first one when I was 7 years old. And then, because of my friend Beatrice, I switched to another group where she was going. And I liked that better, and I stayed in this other group for my whole childhood until I went to university. I was active in Anoa Zioni, which was a lot of fun, and I would go there every Shabbat afternoon. And my family was not observing Shabbat, so I would take public transportation to get there. And one of the things we did every afternoon on Saturday is play ball. We had ball games. And one of these games is also known in the United States, but I don't know what it's called. Like, there's two teams, and you use the ball to kill people. And once, if they don't catch the ball, they're out of the game.
I don't know if I know that game.
So we used to play that a lot, and you had to be good at throwing. It was like a soccer ball. You had to be good at throwing it hard so that people might miss it, but it couldn't go too far because then you had lost. If you didn't throw it in the right place, then your team was losing points or something.
What were your favorite hobbies or after school activities?
My favorite hobbies, I really liked to read. I read a lot. And in that period, do you see my coffee? I think, man.
It's right there.
Thank you. In that period, I mostly read in French. And when I had a little extra money, I would buy books in a bookstore that was not so far from my house. I could get there by myself. And I read books that were specifically for girls and books that were for both boys and girls. And what else did I do? I did not watch TV. We did not have a TV. And my parents didn't want us to have a TV so that I would not get distracted. They wanted me to be a really good student. And so the fact that there was no TV reduced the amount that I would not do my homework. But otherwise, then my parents were nice about it. They wouldn't, insist or check on me. Did you do your homework and stuff like that? I was pretty free.
How did your family celebrate Jewish holidays?
So at home, we celebrated Passover by not eating bread and eating matzah. We celebrated Hanukkah. We lit candles for Hanukkah. And on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I would not go to school. My parents would tell the teacher that I wasn't going to come. I would bring a letter or something. And I didn't really go to pray. I went to the synagogue and met with friends outside the synagogue. That was fun. And when I was older, my parents lived outside of the center of town and was far, a long walk from the synagogue. So when I was older, after the people would go home to rest. In the case of Rosh Hashanah, they would go home to eat, but Yom Kippur, we would go home to rest. And it was too far for me to go all the way home. So I would always go to my best friend at that time. Her name was Diane. In French, you pronounce it Diane.
Yeah. What was the Jewish community like in your hometown?
Very good question. So the Jews in Antwerp had mostly immigrated from Poland. They were mostly Polish Jews, and that includes my family. All my grandparents migrated from Poland to Belgium in the early 20th century. So on my mother's side, my grandparents left Poland around 1910. 1910. So that's more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And the first one to leave from my mother's family was her father and one of his brothers. And then the other brothers came, most of them, and then the parents came. And then at some point, my grandfather went back to Krakow in Poland, and he brought a wife, my grandmother Rosa. And my mother was born in Belgium, and so were her siblings. First 2 boys and then 2 girls, and she was the youngest of 4 children. On my father's side, they left Poland in the 1920s, 10 years later, more or less. And when they migrated, my father was about 12 years old. So he had his bar mitzvah in Antwerp. And they came as a big family. There was my grandparents and their 2 children, and then my grandmother Esther, my father's mother, her name was Esther. And your Auntie Esther is named after her. So my grandmother Esther came from a family of 11 children. She was one of 11.
Was she like the youngest or the middle?
She was the second oldest, I think,
Wow.
of 11. Yes.
It's like great aunt.
Huh?
It's like great aunt. He's the second oldest.
I think she was the second oldest. She had one older sister, and then the people who came to Belgium at the same time were 2 of her brothers who were close in age. The 3 of them were friendly because they had grown up together. Her oldest sister never came, but her 2 brothers that were close to her in age, they came. One was Uncle Max. He was my father's uncle. And the other one was Uncle Zalek. And I knew them very well because after the war, my grandmother Esther was killed in Auschwitz. She was murdered. But these 2 brothers survived. And they had really loved their sister. And so they considered my father and me like their own children. My father was like their son, and I was like their granddaughter. They were always very nice to me. Every birthday, they would buy me beautiful gifts because they didn't have children, young children. They didn't have grandchildren. And in the case of Uncle Max, he had no children at all.
Do you have any special memories of Jewish events or traditions?
Right. So this family of my father, we call that an extended family. So there were quite a few people because there was a 3rd brother of my grandmother who had come, but he was the youngest of all the 11 children. And that's why they called him Binyamin, like Binyamin in the Torah, the brother of Yosef. He was the youngest of all the brothers. So it's a tradition in Jewish families to call the youngest child boy, if it's a boy, Binyamin. And so I had an uncle, Binyamin, but they didn't call him Binyamin. They used a nickname. They called him Yumek, which is a mix of Yiddish and Polish. So the oldest brother, one of the older brothers in Antwerp, his name was Betzalel, but instead of Betzalel, they would say Zalek. So there was Uncle Zalek and Uncle Yumek. And their family name was Haber, Haber. That was my grandmother's maiden name. And they were very nice people. They were fun. They used to tell jokes, and they spoke Yiddish, the whole family. So we would get together often on a Friday night, or you check in on a Shabbat afternoon, or maybe Sunday afternoon. And usually we got together at the house of Uncle Zalek and his wife Berta, Tante Berta. And they would all speak Yiddish. And even though my parents at home did not speak Yiddish, I wanted to understand the jokes that they were telling. They were laughing and having fun. So I tried to pick up Yiddish, and I understand quite a bit of Yiddish because it's similar to German and to Dutch. And since I had to learn Dutch in Antwerp, that was the official language, I was able to pick up Yiddish and understand much of what they were saying. But I didn't really understand many of the jokes because they were not jokes for children.
How many languages did you speak at the time?
So as a child, my first language is French. And soon after that, I learned Dutch because you had to. We lived, the first building where we lived, downstairs there was a grocery store. And my mother would often send me to the grocery store to buy something. All I had to do is get down the stairs and I was in the grocery store. So, but I needed to talk Dutch. They didn't speak French. Most people in Antwerp did not speak French. They only spoke Dutch. And so I picked up Dutch. And the cleaning lady only knew Dutch. And another interesting story is that when I was born, before I was born, my parents hired a nanny who would take care of me. And this nanny had to sign that she would speak French to me. She knew French. She had learned French. And she was not allowed to speak to me in Dutch, only in French. Because French was like, in Canada, they have French and English, and people prefer to speak English. But in Belgium, it's the opposite. At the time, it was the opposite.
Okay.
So I knew French and Dutch, and I understood Yiddish and German.
And tell me about your parents. What were they like?
Oh, I have to bring a picture of my parents since we are now together here. That will just take a minute. I'll bring a whole bunch of pictures.
Yeah.
Okay. And I can send that to you afterwards. So my mother's name, very interesting. We have that in common too. You have an auntie Esther. I didn't have an auntie Esther, but we said something else when you and I had in common. I forgot. In any case, her official name was Anna, just like your mom.
Mhm.
But everybody would call her either Annie or Anneke.
Mm.
And this is my father. And in French, his name was Henri, which is Henry, and it's spelled just like Henry. And his Hebrew name was Chaim Yoshua.
Chaim is
And
Chaim.
so Michal, her full name is Michal Chana. She's named after my mother. And Chaim Shia, is named after my father.
Is the Chai named after Chaim?
Yes, because why Chai? Because if you spell Chaim in Hebrew, the name Chaim starts with a chet, And the name Yoshua, Chaim Yoshua, his middle name is Yoshua, just like my father. That starts with a Yud. So that's Chai. Chet Yud is Chai. So I called his nickname from the time he was a baby. I called him Chai Chai because that was cuter than Chai. Okay. And the reason Michal Chana is not Chana only, but she's first Michal, is because Amos, your grandfather, didn't like the name Chana. He thought it was too old-fashioned. So he said, let's give her another name. And his mother came to visit, Amos's mother, whose name was Natanya, and she proposed the name Michal. I liked the sound of it, so I agreed. Okay. This is my grandmother, Rosa. My mother's mother, no, I'm mixing up. This is my other grandmother, Esther. I'm not sure now. I think this is Esther. Does it look like the same person? Because this is definitely Rosa. That's Rosa, and Shoshana, I'm named after, and she lost her husband, my mother's father, Aaron. His name in Hebrew was Aaron, and his name in German was Arnold. He died when my mother was 7 years old or something. So my grandmother was a widow with 4 children. First, she had 2 boys, Harry and Sam, and then she had 2 girls, Helen and Annie. My mother was the youngest. Okay. You wanted to know more about my parents besides the picture you asked what they were like?
Do you have any interesting stories about your grandparents?
Unfortunately, I never met any of my grandparents because my mother's father died when she was a child. And my mother's mother was killed in Auschwitz. And my father's mother was also killed in Auschwitz. They were both put on trains. The police came to get them in Antwerp. And then they were sent on trains to Auschwitz in Poland and killed in the gas chambers. And my father's father, he's the one who kept the etrog box I showed you last time.
Yeah.
Which I can also show this time.
That's right.
And he survived the war in an old age home in Antwerp, a non-Jewish place. He survived the war. He was not persecuted or killed, but then he died a natural death a few months, 2 months later, maybe, after they liberated Antwerp. The British and the Americans and the Canadians liberated Antwerp. And my grandfather died, and my father came back months later, many months later, from France. My parents were hiding there. By the time my father came, his father had died. So I never knew any of my grandparents.
Did any of our family members immigrate from other countries?
So all of these family members originated, the older generation, they all were Polish. They were born and raised in Poland. My father left Poland when he was 12. My mother was born in Belgium, but all the grandparents came from Poland.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are there any family heirlooms or traditions passed down to you?
Yes, I have the beautiful candelabra that I light every Shabbat. Mm-hmm. I got one set from the grandmother Esther and one set from grandmother Rosa.
Different ones?
Yeah, 2 different sets. The more beautiful ones, the big ones, are from the Grossbart side, from my father's side. Mm-hmm.
What was your biggest dream when you were my age? Don't remember.
My biggest dream when I was your age was to get married and have a lot of children. Because I was an only child and I didn't like it. I didn't have brothers or sisters.
Can you share a challenging experience that taught you an important lesson?
A challenging experience that taught me an important lesson. Yes. I told you the story on Zoom. Now I'll tell you again. So when I was in third grade, might have been second grade. One day, I was in this transmutation class for French speaking girls. And one day, the principal came in and she named the class had about 40 girls.
But she named
And
12.
she, what?
But she just named 12.
About 12. Very good. You remember. And we had to stand against the wall when she named us. And then she said, all these girls are not allowed to continue to study in French. From now on, they will study in Dutch. And there was the next door was the class in Dutch. And we were supposed to go there. And all the Jewish girls were in that group. Not only Jewish girls, but all the Jewish girls were included, including my friend Beatrice, who was in my class. And my friend, the friend who became my friend later, Diane, she was also in my class, but at that time she wasn't my friend. We didn't know each other very well. We were living in different parts of town. So it turns out there were also some non-Jewish girls in this group, including a girl named Mireille Trouillard. Mm-hmm. And Mireille's mother had studied to be a teacher. She had a teacher diploma, elementary school teacher. And she and her husband said, this is not acceptable. We refuse to follow this order. And they had a French name. Mireille is a French name, and Trouillard is a French name. They said, we speak French at home, and this is not acceptable. We refuse to follow these orders, and we're going to take our children out of the class, and I'm going to teach them at home. Whoever wants to come to our house, I will teach their child. So my parents and Beatrice's parents in the beginning, and a bunch of most of these girls, many of these girls, the parents agreed to send their kids to the Trouillard house. And that's what I did for many months. And that was very challenging. It wasn't so far from my house, but I had to walk there.
You studied French there?
So Madame Trouillard, the mother of Mireille, she taught us in French. Yeah, she was French speaking, and she did that. But meanwhile, most of the Jewish girls were not there anymore. Beatrice's parents decided enough is enough. This is anti-Semitic. Why are they taking the Jewish girls and not all the non-Jewish girls? So they explained that they were taking the Jewish girls because the parents must be immigrants and probably don't speak French. But that wasn't true for my parents. My parents spoke French at home. Beatrice's parents spoke French at home. And many of Diane's parents spoke French at home. Many of the parents spoke French. But they didn't even check. They assumed if they're Jewish, they're probably immigrants and they don't know French. That was very wrong. So that's an experience that taught me that there is anti-Semitism. Not first, I already knew that because I knew my mothers had been killed because they were Jewish. That was the only reason. And my father's brother and his wife were also murdered in Auschwitz. And on my mother's side, her oldest brother, Harry, he was killed because he was Jewish, but not in Auschwitz. He argued with some German Nazi in the streets of Antwerp, and they shot him. That's how he was killed. So also because he was Jewish. So I knew there is anti-Semitism, but this was a lesson. I felt it, personally, when they singled me out to leave that French-speaking class.
What's your happiest childhood memory?
My happiest. There are many happy moments, but I really enjoyed when I was little. We would go for family vacations to the seaside in a place named Knokke. And we would rent an apartment there every summer and during Passover vacation, and sometimes in the winter, but mostly Passover vacation and summer. And my mother had a very good friend from childhood. Her name was Margot. And she was a friend. She was not really family. But I called her Tante Margot, Aunt Margot, because my mother and her were very close. And my mother adored her because this Margot saved my mother's life during the war. That's a whole story of its own.
If you could give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
That was Chaim, missed call. I'll tell him that I'll call him later, okay? Just a moment. Just a second. Recent Chaim message with Cara.
Okay. So
Yeah, so
you could give.
I really enjoyed going on vacations to Knokke, to the seaside town, and especially when we were sharing an apartment with Margot and her two children. They were like my cousins because their mother I called Auntie Margot, and they we would be together. We would sleep in the same bedroom, all three of us, and we would ride bikes together. It was a lot of fun. And their names are Alain et Arlette. And I'm still in contact with them. I saw them recently.
Yeah. Okay. If you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh, very good question. Don't pay so much attention to what people think of you, because other people can be mean and jealous, especially if you have a lot of qualities. People are there's a lot of jealousy. If you are smart, if you're good looking, people envy you and they can be mean. And I didn't get a warning about that. I had to learn that from experience.
Do you have any funny or interesting stories about our family you'd like to share?
About our family that I want to share. Well, is it working?
Yeah.
One interesting, I don't know what's interesting about the family, but one thing is that there were very few children in this family. The extended family, is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was the only girl, but there were two boys in the extended family. One was my cousin Izzy, who was the son of Yumek. So he was actually my father's first cousin, because Yumek was the little brother of my grandmother Esther. But Izzy was only 2 years, no, excuse me, he was 6 years older than me. Your father knows him. He lives in Israel. And his full name is Izzy Haber. And he was very nice. I really liked him. And then there was another cousin who was also an only child. Every one of us was an only child. There was a cousin, his first name was Marcel, but that's a man's name. It's spelled in French Marcel when it's a boy. So Marcel, he was just a year older than me. So sometimes our mothers would get together when we were little, and we would go visit them. With my mother and I went to visit them quite a few times. And he and I would play because we were the same age. And then later, I saw him regularly at the family gatherings, and also he went to the same Zionist youth group, Anor Hatzioni, and we had some common friends. And there are a few stories in the family about these cousins and I. So Marcel's father was my father's first cousin. So Marcel was my second cousin. And in the case of Izzy, he was the son of my father's first cousin. So he was a first cousin once removed. But nevertheless, they were the only children in my family that I would see regularly, so I was close to them. And there were two men in my family named Izzy Haber. This cousin, Izzy, that I like, until now I like him, who is 6 years older than me. So he turned 80. He's already 82 years old, because I'm almost 80. Yeah. So, and Marcel is only 1 year older. So in March, he's going to be 78. Now, there was another Izzy Haber in the family. He was also my father's cousin, because another brother of my grandmother, who had migrated to Antwerp, Zalek, he also had a son named Izzy. But this Izzy was much older. He was almost as old as my father. He was maybe, so when I was growing up, I was a child, let's say I was 6, he was 30. He was much older. He was like the generation of the parents. He could have had children, but he didn't. Now, they were both Izzy Haber, the same exact name, except their full name was different, because the Izzy son of Yumek, his name was Isidore. And Izzy Haber, the son of Zalek, he was Israel Haber. His full name was Israel.
Israel Haber?
Huh?
Israel Haber?
Haber. They were both Haber. They were both, and everybody called both of them Izzy Haber. But in the case of the younger one, it was short for Isidore, and his Hebrew name was Yitzhak. It's Yitzhak. And the other one was Israel. Haber, and from Israel they made easy.
Mm.
And the older one was a doctor in medicine. He was practicing medicine, and he had studied at the university. And the younger one was a businessman. He became a businessman. He's very well to do. He's rich. He and his wife are rich. They have a beautiful apartment. They have 2 children. They've done very well in Israel. But at the time when I was a child, the doctor was like a big deal. Dr. Haber. People were very proud of having a relative who was a medical doctor.
Mm.
In those days, not many Jews had studied medicine. It was a big deal. And this easy Haber doctor, we would call him Easy Doctor. Easy Doctor, and the other Easy was Le Petit Easy, the little Easy, because he was much younger. So that's funny.
Yeah. Is there anything else you think is important for me to know about our family history?
Yes, something very interesting. When I went to Poland to get some documentation about my relatives, so they came from 2 different towns. My mother's family came from Krakow, which is a big city in Poland. And my father's family came from Tarnów, which is also a big city, but not as big as Krakow and not as beautiful. But anyways, the visit to Tarnów was more interesting because when I was there, I met a man who was a school teacher in the elementary school. He was the gymnastics teacher, but his hobby was gather documents and write books about the history of the town. And more particularly, not about the whole town, but that a part of the town that was called Żabno. That's where my family actually came from Żabno, which is near Tarnów. And when he found out my last name was Grosbach, I showed him my business card with my name, Shoshana Grosbach. He jumped. Grosbach, are you related to Chaim? No, yeah, to Chaim Shir Grosbach? I'll show you his book when I'll take a break. When we take a break, I'll show you his book. So I said, yeah, that's my father. My father's Hebrew name is Chaim Shir Grosbach. Oh, he said, your father is a famous man here in Żabno. And I looked at him. I said, how can that be? He left. He left Poland when he was 12 years old, and then he came to Belgium. How can he be famous? He said, he showed me his book. He said, look, I wrote a book about the Jews of Żabno. And I checked documents from the time that Żabno was under Austrian rule. The Emperor of Austria, which was a big country, had invaded Poland and ruled over Poland, and they created city councils. And 2 of my great grandfathers served on this city council. And the one named Grosbach, he built the first elementary school. He was rich, and he had a construction company, and he built the school. And in the records of the city, it says Chaim Shir Grosbach got reimbursed for building the school. And then I looked at the book and I said, Yitzchak Haber, I said, oh, Yitzhak Haber is also my great grandfather. He was the father of my grandmother Esther. Her father's name was Yitzhak Haber. And it said in the records, he got reimbursed for building the sidewalk in the central square of the city. So both my great grandfathers were famous in Jabno, and I'll show you the document.
That was the last question. That was the last question.
That was the last question. We're finished. Okay, I'm gonna go bring you the book. I hope I find it.
Thanks for doing it with me.
No, no, no.